Who gave them the right to charge us for water and land they didn't create? We should not be paying anything for our existence on this earth. Let that sink in. Let it scrape against everything that you've been taught. Because the most insane idea humanity ever normalized is that you owe money simply for being alive. You were born here without consent on a planet you did not create, under a sky that no government ever hung, breathing air that no corporation manufactured, and somehow you start life already in debt. That's not normal. That's not moral. That is not even sane. Explain to me how land became owned. Explain how water became a bill. Explain how shelter became rent, movement became a license, and rest became something you have to earn after selling most of your waking hours. They didn't just monetize labor, they monetized survival. And the moment survival has a price tag, freedom is gone. Because if you must comply to be allowed to live, that is not choice. That is coercion.
Did you know I was personally dragged into the whistleblowing about the sexual abuse, trafficking of vulnerable women at the nonprofit organization with a false accusation by the female central to my story? I had support from some famous people like...
One man told me about being beaten by the police and left permanently disabled because of a woman's false allegation.
Hello, it's January 2026. Now, this video is inspired by a conversation that I had with someone, and it had to do with a video reel that they wanted me to watch and then asked about it. Now, this video posed the question, I'm just going to kind of paraphrase everything here, about why people have to pay to simply exist. And then it gets into about rights and everything else. Now, I've stated before that rights are a privilege, and that privilege can be revoked for different reasons. Now, can it be revoked for bad reasons? Sure, why not? But it can be revoked. And I've also mentioned in previous videos how people make a claim that it's their God-given right to have freedom or something. No. And I've addressed this in videos before. Now, people watching might be triggered by this, the reality. I don't really care. I'll get over it. Now, what I really want to focus on here is this whole thing about people paying to exist. Now, I'm just going to segue for a moment. Has what I'm about to say been used maliciously or for self-serving interests of a handful of people? Absolutely. But to address the question how all this began, and I'm going to expand on this in a little bit. Really, it began when you had small little groups of people coming together to survive. More hands meant more can be done. It also means that more resources have to be used, but that's a different tangent. But people would start to come together and build small communities. It started with, say, family units, and then you'd have marriages and then bringing in new family units and growing from there. But the issue is that this would evolve into small tribes. And tribes would be warring with each other for resources and land and everything else, just like what we could see, for example, today. And these feuds were brutal. You'd have one group taking over another group in that land, making claim to it. And you'd have somebody who'd come along with, say, the biggest group in the area and say, listen, we've been really successful at this. For example, and I'm simplifying this history so it could be easily followed. And one person would say, well, I'll rule over this. I'll call myself, I don't know, a king. And I'll offer protection and an infrastructure. And this is key, is the infrastructure part. Because infrastructure is what keeps a society functioning successfully. I want to segue for a moment. Now, I recall, I don't know, a few decades ago at least, reading about how archaeologists almost missed this great civilization. I forget what it was called. And they almost missed it because when they look for a civilization, traditionally, mainstream way, they look for key things. For example, money, a whole list of laws, and war type of tools. And the civilization, which apparently was pretty massive at its time, didn't have these things. But then when they started digging it up, they started realizing this place was huge. And it spread far and wide. You can tell the success of a civilization by how little laws they had, by how little, for example, currency they needed, and how little military armament that they needed to survive. Because these things showed how the people of that civilization got along. And they got along not because of so-called differences and all this other stuff, but they got along because they had common ground. They had common ground, for example, with social standards, and they had common ground with traditions. They had common ground with things of that nature. So they didn't need to be micromanaged. They were independent, they were strong in character, perhaps even strong physically, but I digress there. So they were free in a sense, but still functioned together. So going back to now, when you had these different tribes coming together, you'd have a king, and the king said, listen, I'm bringing everyone together, so we're uniting to maintain the protection as well as the infrastructure. I need money for that. Fine. And then things started to become, as a descriptive, more organized. Through that, people had more time. More time meant they became bored. And then eventually socially, they would start to go downhill. But I digress. And it said that these tribes and stuff, well, they didn't own land. Well, they didn't own land, for example, in the same way that land would be owned today, but they did make claim to land, whether it be in these small isolated groups, to tribes, to uniting these tribes to create something bigger, something greater. but they make claim to it. And the land that everyone agreed that would be, as a descriptive, a small civilization or even a large civilization, this is what the people wanted. It's not that somebody came along and said, hey, I'm going to take this by force. The people wanted it because they realized that unity was a good thing. It achieved things. And allowed more time to do other things other than just simply survive. And part of that survival was reproduction. So in essence, this is how everything evolved to where we are today. Now, what happened where we are today is a small handful of people took advantage of that and completely use that system for their own benefits, for their own gains. And this is where we're at today when we get into, for example, the micromanaging of civilization, creating more laws and everything else. And you compound that with the human species being a bored species and being dumbed down and becoming very soft. It all goes to the cycles of civilizations and the patterns within. But everything that's been taking place is what the people want. On everything. We even see, for example, in modern times, how people assume that, oh, it's the government that's imposing this. It's the government. Well, a government may offer something, but it's the people who, the majority, who want whatever. And this is why things have gone the way they have. And it's getting worse. Just because your group of like-minded see things differently doesn't mean that it's the majority. I've talked about, for example, democracy, where you have 51% of the population that can take away the rights of 49%. What if that 51%, as a descriptive, are stupid? That means policies and everything else that follow are stupid. And these are the people who've surrendered, allowed the opportunity for a handful of people to gain control. Now, how do these people gain control? Well, some might say that it was done through brute force. No. It wasn't done by force at all. See, when you had these small little communities that formed into tribes and then grew into, for example, a civilization, you had people of like mind, the same values, traditions, and social standards. And they may have come far and wide to unite, but there was always that common ground to build something. And that created what's called a high trust society. And all you need is a handful of people who either come from a distrustful society, or they themselves are distrustful. They have perhaps even some wires crossed in their own minds, as a descriptive. And they take advantage of high trust society. You can see that today, for example, where you have people not understanding how a handful of people that run the world can do what they do, commit atrocities and everything else, because they're still human nature's high trust working together. And I know there's all these so-called great philosophers, and I've said before for decades that philosophy is a scam. It complicates the uncomplicated. Now, originally, the whole idea of philosophy was to think outside the box. It was never meant to be its own discipline where now people can get a PhD in that nonsense. Just like the nonsense of the liberal arts, theoretical pseudoscience of psychology. So, going back to this video, how did this become in all this freedom stuff? Freedom comes from discipline. And I've highlighted an ex-Marine who has actually titled a book on like that. Because with discipline means you're self-reliant. You're not having to outsource your own safety, your own resolution of problems or anything else. At one time, for example, people would go to the king when they couldn't figure out a solution between, say, for example, two parties. Well, somebody has to decide. The people wanted it. They went to that king. And over time, that gave them more power and everything else. It was none of this, what's happening today, was created through brute force. The people are to blame if there's any blame to be given. And yes, there are people who've exploited that, but the people didn't create the world as it is, then the people exploiting it wouldn't have that opportunity. They would still be working at trying to take advantage of a high trust society. And then we have the problem now where you have different societies, different peoples, different cultures, whatever you want to categorize, however you want to categorize that, where some are inherently low trust, now mixing in with those who are inherently high trust. And we see problems now arising. But the real downfall of high trust society is boredom. People want all this technology. They want their lives to be easier. For what? What do people do when they have more time, especially in today's world, is they waste it. And they're so consumed by everything in today's world, they haven't gone within themselves and become weak that way. And the number one thing that takes people from life, for example, in a real survival situation, say stranded on an island or in the mountains in a plane crash or something, is an individual's own mind. That is people's worst enemy. And in today's world, people are not comfortable in their own mind because they have all these distractions. And that's all I really wanted to address here, was how, or to give answer to this video about how did this become that people have to pay to exist, because people have ultimately surrendered that. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share.
Are these fuels really from fossils, or are they being generated deep in the mantle of the Earth? And an abiotic process, which is renewable and continues to happen as we speak. Now, in the West, It is almost universally held that oil and gas is derived from fossils. This is not the case elsewhere, particularly among Russian and Ukrainian scientists who have over several generations tenaciously propounded the notion that oil and gas are abiotic, can be found deep below the surface of the earth in most parts of the world and in very large amounts. And more, the Western world is coming, well, to realize that this may be the case.
Just remember, I was one man against many. Fighting a losing battle, but I still fought to the end.
That means press on. That means endure. That means God cannot fail, and you're not going to give up. That's not an option for a child of God. This means you are going to be remembered. Listen to this and write it down if you can't remember it. You're never going to outgrow warfare. You simply must learn to fight. I hear people say, when is it going to get easier? When you die.